Hello and welcome to the very first deep dive we have for our 10 Commandments sermon series. I'm really excited to have you all join me as we take a deeper look at what these laws are and how are they relevant for us today. Living in the 21st century, here in the United States, I think we are so deeply separated from the traditions of the ancient Near East, and we're separated by more than just time. I think distance from this location, our socio-political norms, our own religious traditions, and cultural heritage really make it hard for us to envision the time in which the Ten Commandments were given to the Hebrew people. And so I think in a lot of ways it's created this situation where we think about the Ten Commandments as Christians, and we kind of think, well, we don't need those anymore. They don't have any relevance for our lives today. But I think that over the course of this study and this sermon series, if we take our study of these commandments seriously, I think we might find that they not only have relevance for us, but can actually help us renew our own faith experiences. So let's go ahead and kind of dive into the background behind the Ten Commandments. So, the question that I have for you is really, what is the purpose of law, especially as it relates to the Bible? Now, when we look at the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, you might hear me call it, you find that law is so integral to the stories in this bigger story, just because of the sheer volume of law that exists, and also the centrality that law has within the larger biblical text. The amount of space that's devoted to the Sinai event, this crossing, right, the Exodus event, the crossing of the Hebrew people out of Egypt through the Red Sea, led by Moses, and then the law that was given at Mount Sinai to the people through Moses, really forms sort of this central moment by which all the other stories in the Bible are formed. So we could really look at the Sinai event, this the giving of the law at Mount Sinai, sort of as this like central event. And on either side of that, right, we see the story arc. So the folks came, Moses led folks out of slavery, and then through the Sinai event leads them into freedom. Oh, what do we mean by that? Because out of slavery can mean many things, and into freedom can also mean many things. And I hope that you have a really rich discussion of this in your common table groups. But law is so important in the Bible that it behooves us to really think about the law more deeply. And so when we do that, I think it really is useful to start thinking about it as sort of a broader context, not just within the biblical text itself, but what was going on socially, politically, culturally in this area that we call the Near East. And so let's look at those laws, right? In Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 8, Moses asks the people, right? He says, "And what other great nation has statutes and ordinances as just as this entire law that I am setting before you today?" Well, Moses, we know that there was a lot of law in the ancient Near East. Those civilizations were very advanced in how they thought about justice and what their societies looked like and how they operated. Um, and so I think it helps for us to think about some of the law that existed within the Fertile Crescent. So that area around the Mesopotamian river. So one of the oldest examples of law is the Code of Hammurabi, which originated somewhere around 1750 BCE. And so it was written in the first dynasty of Babylon, and it's probably one of the best preserved of any of the legal codes that we know about. There's a 300-line prologue that begins with this outline that describes Hammurabi's royal authority for setting law, and then moves into a body of text that outlines how society should be set up. So the thing about this, though, is that they aren't laws like do not steal or do not ride your skateboards on the sidewalk. They're not laws the way that we necessarily think about laws. And in some ways, scholars think this might actually be more about the theory of legal systems, because the codes that are within this, that are written down on the stele that you can find in the Louvre, I should put a picture in this for you because I got to see it right before the whole world shut down. But the laws, the codes are written in sort of these if-then statements. If you do X, then Y will happen. And so we see that actually a lot. We'll talk about that in some of the Hittite laws that came about a little bit later. But this document, what it tells us about the society that existed at this time was that people were not equal under the law. Men and women are treated differently through the codes. Free persons and slaves are treated differently. Different social classes are treated differently under the law. And this is the code. Where we actually find that sort of eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth treatment that I think sometimes we ascribe to the Old Testament, but really comes out of sort of the legal jurisprudence of the Near East. These codes are based on honor and shame, which undergirds the legal system, but also undergirds the entire social structure. And so if you cause someone shame or you hurt their honor, there's stiff penalties for that. And then there's also really specific codes about who gets honor, right? And who deserves shame. And we can learn a lot about a culture and what they value by looking at these codes. So a little bit later, the 1650s to 1100 BCE was sort of the zenith of the Hittite Empire. So the Hittite Empire was on the Anatolian Peninsula, which is, where you find Turkey today. And these laws stretch this, 500-ish year time period. And they're formulated also as case laws, right? They start with a condition and they follow with a ruling. So for instance, one of them was, if anyone tears off the ear of a male or female slave, he shall pay 3 shekels of silver. It begs the question, who was going around doing this, that they needed this sort of law? But here you go. There's a law. If you do X, Y happens. And so there's about 200 of these if-then statements, and they're on 2 different tablets. And they really do cover all sorts of different topics, from homicide to kidnapping to runaway slaves to marriage to the way land should be administered, to animals that are injured. All sorts of different types of laws are found within these Hittite laws, but they reflect sort of this royal law, which is seated in this legal responsibility of governors to enact these laws and create the legal customs. The laws that we find, the reason why we talk about these is because they're similar to a lot of the various biblical laws that we find. And so it really kind of points out to us that there were a lot of shared legal traditions in this area. So the demarcation between Hittite, the Hittite Empire and Judea and, some of these, Babylon and Assyria, these borders were a lot more fluid and less set in stone than I think sometimes our own mythology lets us think. They shared a lot of things, but legal tradition is one of those. But the thing that I really want us to focus on, the thing that I think is very extraordinarily important, especially as we look at the Sinai event, is something called a suzerain vassal treaty. Well, suzerain sounds like a funny name, but suzerain is basically the person who's in charge of something. A vassal is somebody who gives honor to that suzerain. And these were treaties that were set up between different communities, different countries, really different empires. And they're formal agreements that broker power and assign obligations between these two parties that usually were kings, but they could be other forms of rulers. So sometimes the kings were of equal status, but most of the time in these treaties, we find that one member, the suzerain, was superior to the other, who is the vassal. The most famous of these Near Eastern treaties was found, comes to us from the Hittite Empire. So in the early to mid second millennium BCE. So between the Hittites and the Neo-Assyrians, whose kingdom just really flourished. The Neo-Assyrian kings imposed these treaty-like agreements on entire populations. And they usually had 6 basic features. They had a preamble that identified who the suzerain was. They had a historical prologue that recounted the previous relationship that existed between these two parties. They always had covenant stipulations to which the vassal had to agree in order for these treaties to work. There were provisions for periodic reading and safekeeping of the covenant. There are witnesses to the covenant. And then there were always blessings and curses that would fall upon the vassal if they should fail to if they should fail the covenant or keep the covenant, right? So these treaties almost always invoked divine powers that witnessed the stipulations and the oaths that the parties took to ensure that they would abide by them. And they were almost always, as the physical documents were almost always deposited in a temple to serve as a reminder to the gods who enforced these treaties. So these are really early examples of what covenant looked like in this time period and in this socioeconomic political climate that really sort of can help inform our understanding of why the 10 Commandments in Exodus and Deuteronomy look the way they do. So when we view covenant through the lens of the ancient Near East, this covenant that was given to Moses and really to the people through Moses really starts to resemble the shared legal tradition, especially from the suzerain vassal treaties. Now, in your groups, I hope that you'll spend some time looking at the different ways that this happens. But we'll find these preambles that identify God as the suzerain. We see historical recollections of how how this relationship came to be. There's obviously covenant stipulations because that's what the Ten Commandments are, right? So there's some really interesting literary, right, crossover and shared tradition that goes into the creation of these Old Testament laws. And so there's some really good conversation we can have about what does it mean to have a covenant between unequals, and what then becomes the basis for that covenant. Is that covenant based on the suzerain's power or the vassal's obedience? These are really important questions for us to talk about because it starts to give us this picture of who God is. That is really important. Now, I asked at the beginning of this, what is the purpose of law? The purpose of law, we really need to think about the basis of law and the function of law and the goal of law. And I would say that the basis of law is this covenantal relationship with God in which God freely binds God's self to God's people and then commands God's people to sustain that covenantal relationship. The function of law then is to sustain that covenantal relationship. And the goal of law then is the formation of a liberated people for service to God. I think that when we think about this Mosaic covenant law through the lens of this basis for law, the function of this law, and the goal of law, I think we can start to think about how this law tells us more about who God is, about who God wants us to be, and it helps us start to find relevance for the Ten Commandments in our everyday lives. So in order to really dive into this, we need to look at the Ten Commandments themselves. So in English, we call them the Ten Commandments, but in Greek, it's called the Decalogue, which is a transliteration from Hebrew and really means 10 words or 10 sayings of God. And so I think when we look at that, we can see them as sayings, especially when we compare them to the Code of Hammurabi or to the Hittite law, which had a lot of if-then statements. These are a little bit more like sayings. God has said something that's worth probably paying attention to, don't you think? So it seems like a silly question to ask, can you name the 10 Commandments? Can you name all of them? But the reason why I ask this question is that if you actually go through, say, Exodus 20, verses 2 through 17, what you find is that you might be able to come up with anywhere from 9 to 13 commandments, depending on what you think the commandments are. And actually, different religious traditions have grouped these together in different ways to sort of get 10 altogether. Because again, in Hebrew, these are called the 10 utterances or the 10 words of God. And so our religious tradition wants to preserve that 10. But again, if you were just to count, you might find anywhere from 9 to 13. So what does that mean? what does that tell us about these commandments and what we have traditionally and historically thought about them? Well, I think it's interesting that there have been some shifts in how we think about them. We'll talk a little bit more about this as we sort of dive into some of these other sessions that we'll be looking at some of the other laws, but some of these laws have actually been molded and changed and altered a little bit over time, because that's what law does. That's what cultures do. And so a lot of times we think about the 10 Commandments being given to Moses, written on stone tablets, and we say, no, these are written in stone. This is the way it has to be. But even the Hebrew people, as they formed the Torah, right, the book of law, the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, what we call it, they knew that law had to change to match how cultures change. And so I think that it's helpful for us to think about these as not necessarily being written, even though they were written in stone, because I mean, that's where you wrote things, stone tablets, if you wanted them to last. That maybe it's not written in metaphorical stone. How could we reconcile that? And that might be a really interesting conversation for you to have with your common table. How do we reconcile the way different traditions have viewed these laws, and with some knowledge that these laws have changed a little bit as time has progressed? So you see that change happen a little bit from Exodus 20, verses 1 through 17, to Deuteronomy 5, verses 1 through 21. So even though, for the most part, these texts are word for word identical, you will find as you go through these two texts that there are differences in them. Deuteronomy was written later. And there are some scholars that might even argue that those who wrote Deuteronomy even went back to Exodus and maybe altered some things so that the two passages sort of worked alongside each other better. That's up for you to debate and to have conversations about. But I love to posit that idea out there that it's possible that there was editing that was going on as these stories that began as oral tradition were written down over time. So take time and look at these two passages and see where you might find things that are similar, but also where are the differences in the text, and what does that mean? And then what might be really, really helpful is to even look at these two passages within their contexts in the biblical text. So Exodus happens in a certain way, and the passages in Deuteronomy come about after a certain way too. And the differences that you see in those, as well as similarities, can help us start to dive into a little bit more about the law itself. So I just want to throw out this idea that understanding parallel texts that seem very similar can actually tell us a lot more about the law when we start to look through some of those differences. As you go through this study, I really encourage you to look at it in new eyes, to not necessarily think about the ways in which the Old Testament has been used, and I would argue maybe even abused, and to think about it as maybe not something written in such immutable kinds of ways, because I think it might help us start to unpack not only our own experiences and our own lenses for how we approach this study, but also the ways in which the Hebrew people approached these laws and their own study of this. And then when we get there, we might have a better understanding of how Jesus, through Jesus's own lens, which is a very special lens, interprets this law for those in the first century CE. So take time in your group and really unpack these texts and ask yourself the questions, how have I experienced the Old Testament? And how could this study make me approach these laws with new eyes and with a new heart that allows us to see the relevance that these laws can have for us today in the 21st century. This is a very rich topic of conversation, and I cannot wait to hear more about the myriad ways in which you all are conversing about this study. So enjoy and happy study.